After becoming the first person to cross China on his motorcycle, Jim Rogers spent 3 years circumnavigating the globe, traveling 100,000 miles across 6 continents. He returned a decade later for a 116-country trip during the turn of the millennium that took him another 150,000 miles. In the years before these adventures, Jim's investment portfolio increased 4,200% during a decade where the S&P 500 went up less than 50%. His books include Investment Biker, Adventure Capitalist, Hot Commodities, A Bull in China, A Gift to My Children, and Street Smarts. Jim is the star of numerous documentaries, including The Long Ride and The Party's Over, as well as my films, The Housing Bubble and The Fall of 2008. Today, Jim Rogers becomes the first guest on Let Us Disagree with Jimmy Morrison. Obviously, you're one of the best investors of the last century, but I think something that a lot of people have heard about but don't really know as many of the details is your adventures around the world. I would say you're one of the best explorers from the past century as well. Did you have other explorers or adventurers that you looked up to that inspired you, or were you just like, no, I'm going to take off and just start traveling, and it doesn't matter how successful I've been as an investor, like I'm just going to go off-road and do it?
I mean, I just wanted to see the world. You call it adventure. Yes, I wanted adventure very, very much. That was my goal in life, was to see the world. I did it once and it was so much fun and so exciting that I did it again. So yeah, I guess I'm one of those bizarre or weird people who likes adventure and wants to see the world. So I did it twice.
Before becoming the first person to drive a motorcycle across China, had you traveled much? I know you retired when you were 37, right around that time. Had you traveled much at that point in your life?
Not compared to what I eventually did. No, I mean, I wanted to see things. I wanted to go places. I went some places, but no, the answer is no. My real adventures and travels were after I retired and started seeing the world.
I remember a story in a book that I read, 10 years ago, and it seems almost like a dream. Like it's like it can't possibly have been the real story. So I got to ask you, did you hear about Woodstock when you were working on Wall Street in your early years on Wall Street? And did you find your way up that way, or am I remembering the story incorrectly?
Oh, that's exactly what happened. I was at work one day, heard about it, went home, got on my bike and rode up to Woodstock. The roads were closed because the government, everybody was trying to stop people from going because it had already gotten out of hand. So I had to go around roadblocks and various sundry problems, but I made it. Whenever I would see a roadblock, I would figure out a way to go around it. I remember I would have to cut through people's yards at times. One time I cut through a lady's yard. She came out screaming at me wildly. And in her yard, I got a flat tire. I went across a nail. So I had to
Oh
go back
man.
to the service station and repair the tire. But I eventually, when I got to Woodstock, I don't know why, but I rode right up to the stage. The stage was enclosed. There was a fence around it, but I parked right at the fence and crawled under the fence uh, into the stage enclosure, crawled up on and the Woodstock people had special jackets for the security staff. They were green jackets. They had a guitar and a dove on the back. And so, but it's such a hot day that many of the security people just hung their jacket on the fence or wherever they could. I saw a jacket, got a jacket, put it on, crawled up on the stage, and I was the security. I was this volunteer security guy. It was wonderful. They fed me. It was great.
What acts do you remember seeing that stuck out to you?
Well, I remember Janis Joplin was right there. The Who was right there. I mean, they were all right there.
Yeah.
Literally a few feet away from me because I was the security. I was the security guard, and so they were all right, literally a few feet from me.
I recently read Investment Biker, which was a phenomenal book. I really encourage everybody to check out all your books because each one you have so many different adventures you've gone on that each book has its own unique stories and unique things to take from it. And so I really enjoyed a lot of your books. But the most recent one's Investment Biker, so I do want to talk about that one a little more than the other ones. So when you decided to ride a motorcycle across China, obviously nobody had ever done that, and it was a time of huge change for China. Like, how did you prepare for something like that when there wasn't really anybody you could turn to that would, give you a map of how they did it or anything like that?
When I went to China, I didn't speak any Chinese. The first word I learned was mayo. Mayo basically means no, do not, cannot, are you crazy? And I went to China, Beijing, said, hello, I want to ride a motorcycle across China. They knew I was crazy. And I said, well, do you have roads? Mayo. Do you have restaurants? Mayo. You have hotels? Mayo. You have gasoline? Mayo. And they were right. They didn't have anything. Um, the first, but then they knew I was crazy, but they wanted to see if I was a spy. I mean, that's what I think happened. And they said I could ride around one province. Uh, so I guess to check me out, my girlfriend from New York and I went to a province called Fujian province. And everywhere we went, there were gigantic mobs because they had never seen foreigners. This is the very first beginning of China opening up. They'd never seen foreigners, they'd never seen white people, and they'd never seen, oh my God, American white people, American foreigners. It was just stunning. One time my girlfriend and I were surrounded by hundreds of people, and an old woman came over to my girlfriend and pulled open her top. And I don't know what she was doing, but she was looking into the top and speaking to everybody. I don't know what she was telling them, but she was giving a description or discussion of something, looking at my girlfriend's top. My girlfriend was shocked. Everybody was shocked. I was shocked. The police were shocked. The police had to come and clear the way and get us out of there because it was causing chaos. This old woman talking about my woman's breast. And it was quite an adventure. Every time I traveled across China, it was an adventure. Now, I mean, China's different now. China's got the best roads in the world. They got great hotels. They've got great everything. But in those days, there was nothing.
So when you were out in the middle of nowhere, what did you do to protect your bike? It seems like these are the harshest conditions that had to just be so hard on your motorcycle.
Well, everywhere we went and decided to sleep, the first place we went was the police station. And we told the police, showed the police, etc., and parked the bikes at the police station. The idea being that they would be safe at the police station. I didn't know anything else to do. It worked. I mean, we made it. We're alive and well. The bikes made it, so it did work.
In your book, you talk about your girlfriend at the time, Tabitha, that she kept wiping out on her motorcycle, which you'd think you do that once, you don't get back on and keep going. But she said she went from being afraid of the road and the potholes and stuff to it was more of an affront to her. It was something that was taking her on. And so she more got angry instead of afraid. And that was kind of a turning point for the trip, it seemed like.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, I don't remember that specific conversation now, but no, I know it happened. And yes, no, in the end, she was terrific. I mean, she could ride anywhere, and she did ride anywhere. In the beginning, I just assumed she was going to get killed because she kept having accidents. Fortunately, she became a fabulous driver. She could ride a motorcycle anywhere, and did. I mean, she went around the world. Her first motorcycle trip was around the world into the Guinness Book of Records. That was the first time she'd ever been on a motorcycle. Then she went to the Guinness Book of World Records.
One thing I found is that travel just really you have your worst moments and your best moments, and for a relationship, traveling Some people would look at it as testing a relationship, but other people might look at it as, strengthening it and giving you more life experience.
If you're in a relationship, the best way, a good way to test it is to take a trip together. Get in a car and drive to Miami. You pick the city. Because if you can make it together, traveling in a car or a motorcycle, whatever, it's the relationship is probably going to last. Because it's a real serious test of any relationship. Traveling, taking a road trip together is a serious test. So if you're not sure, get in the car and drive to Miami or somewhere.
So did you have any major accidents?
And I don't remember any major. I mean, I don't remember going to a hospital for a week or something. There were problems at times. Yes, if you drive around the world, you're going to have some problems. I assure you, most parts of the world don't have roads, don't have anything. So you're going to have unexpected events, unexpected places. But I mean, I was determined. I was determined to do. That's all I wanted to do at that point in my life was to go around the world on that motorcycle, and I did it. It was just pure stubbornness, foolishness, craziness. That's what I wanted to do, so I did it.
So looking back, it's really phenomenal that you went at the time that you did, because not only did you get to see China changing, but you got to see the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991. What was that like? Getting to not only like see that going through it, but getting to have personal conversations with people that maybe hadn't even, like you said, met somebody from the United States, or maybe wasn't even allowed to talk about people from the United States.
There were all sorts of safeguards in China and Russia about Americans, foreigners, I should say, especially Americans. Uh, in China, the women were told that if they kissed a foreigner, they would get sick and die, and die. There was Beijing was doing their best to keep people away from foreigners. They didn't want to be any mixing of the outside world. I mean, in Russia, there was nothing there. There was very little food. There was bread, there were pickles, and that was pretty much it. And there were very few places, no, very few hotels. There was no such thing as a hotel in Russia in those days, in Siberia in those days. So every day was an adventure just to stay alive, much less to find a place to sleep. But here I am still alive. I still have my arms and legs, and somehow it worked.
What was it like after going from such extreme conditions like, Western China or Siberia, like you were just talking about? What was it like to come out of that, come back to Europe, and, get back to some easier living?
Well, when we crossed into Finland from from Russia, it was almost a miracle. I mean, I thought I was going to kiss the border guard. I was so happy to be alive and to be in a real country with things like traffic lights and hotels and gas stations. It was a huge, gigantic change to leave the wilderness to back to civilization. I mean, that happened in Africa too. Obviously, when some countries had absolutely no development, and so when you got out of those countries, you were in heaven. You know, I remember when I got to Botswana, I couldn't believe it. There were roads, there were traffic lights, there were road signs, saying where we were and where we were going. I mean, Botswana was a miracle as far as I was concerned when I first wound up in Botswana back in those days.
So you went through all the way down through Africa. What was the desert like? It seems like you're not going to be able to just find a road across the desert. What was that experience?
But I mean, looking back on a lot of this now, I certainly know I shouldn't be alive. It's a miracle that I am still alive. There were no roads. If a truck crosses the Sahara Desert, it leaves a track in the sand, and we would try to follow the tracks. We didn't know if the tracks knew what they were doing. We had no idea if the tracks had any clue but it was all we had to go on, so we would follow the tracks.
Were you using maps and compasses at all, or?
No, there weren't. Most of Africa, I mean, in fact, a lot of the world in those days didn't have maps. It was very hard to find a map. There was a store in London that was supposedly an international store that had some maps, and there was a store in Munich that had some maps, but maps were scarce of the places we were going in those days. I mean, you can certainly get a map of California, but we weren't in California at that time.
I mean, it definitely wasn't California. You even went to some war zones. So can you mention what it was like traveling through a war zone?
Well, in Angola, there was a gigantic war of many years and we shouldn't have been there. I mean, we were crazy. We every week or every month or something, the army would take travelers through the war zone, and we got to the checkpoint once, and it said it'd be a week before the army would go again. So we decided to go on our own. Didn't want to wait. I mean, I was really foolish in those days, still am, but especially then. So we set off on our own. We go through checkpoints. The soldiers were teenage boys for the most part. We had learned by then that teenage boys like cigarettes, so we had some extra cigarettes to give to people as bribes or as gifts, whatever you want to call them. And we made it. The teenage boys were always terrified because here were these white people, American white people from abroad coming along. They didn't know what to do. We were once, the general stopped us, and we found out later that he made us sleep that night near his camp. And we found out later the next day that they were bombing the bridge. They were placing mines on the bridge to protect themselves from the enemy. And if we kept going, we would have crossed the bridge with mines and we would have been blown up. I mean, thank God he knew what he was doing. None of us spoke the same language, so he couldn't explain it to us. But the next day in that particular incident, I had a Polaroid camera and I took a picture of the general. He had never seen a picture of himself, so he was extremely excited. We then took pictures of all of his soldiers, and he took us to his general, so he could take pictures of his general with the Polaroid camera. And his general had never seen a picture of himself either. Fortunately, we got out of there alive, and I guess they still have their pictures.
What was it like getting across the borders in all these countries? Was it a lot simpler back then, or is it easier now? Was it easier back then because you could bribe people? Like, what was it like getting from country to country?
We rarely, I don't remember having to bribe people to cross borders. Borders were usually complicated, but especially for us because we were Americans. And there weren't many Americans on motorcycles or anything showing up at the border. And it was always an issue of what to do because we had these two Americans. I mean, I made it, I'm alive and I did it, but it was always a complicated issue of, oh my gosh, what do we do with these guys? Sometimes they would send us to the front of the queue. There was nearly always a queue. And at times, fortunately, they would send us to the front of the queue, I think mainly to get rid of us. That's what they were trying to do. But I mean, this was all a lot of fun at the time and perplexing. I didn't know what to do in most cases, but here I am. I'm alive.
So from there, you went to South America. What was it like coming up through South America back then?
Well, South America was a little more developed. There was the Trans-American Highway, which was a railroad and was used more than others because there weren't many other roads. The main thing was that the border crossings were a little more developed, I should say, because if you rode the Trans-American Highway, there was only one highway and one border crossing, etc. So it was a little bit more I do not want to say simple, but at least people knew what you were doing, and they knew why you were there, and they knew what your passport was. They knew why you had a passport. They had to see your passport. These things were a little bit developed in South America. Not much, but a little bit.
Did you find translators, or how were you able to communicate and like order food and stuff like that?
Well, in many parts of the world, there is an English teacher because many schools had English, or had people teaching English. And so we would always try to find the local English teacher, if there was one, to be our translator. Otherwise, it was sign language, pure and simple sign language. You go to a restaurant and we'd walk around the restaurant and look at people's tables to see what they were eating. And then we would show the waiter what the people were eating and explain, and by sign language, explain that's what we want. I mean, most parts of the world didn't even have English. Well, they had English because many schools taught English. So if you could find the local English teacher, chances are you'd have hope. And often in small towns, especially, word quickly got to the local English teacher that there were English-speaking Americans in town. And the English teacher would often find us because they wanted to speak English with real English speakers. But other than that, it was usually complicated.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you made it back to the U.S. after such an extensive journey, did you have trouble adjusting back to normal American life?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, every morning you woke up, there was electricity, there was radio, there was television, there was something. There were people who could speak your language. There was food, gasoline. No, it was very, very different. You didn't have to find a place to sleep every night. When you were traveling around the world, every night you have to find a place to sleep. You know, it's not as though there's a Motel 6 everywhere waiting for travelers to come in. No, you had to find it if you could find it. And sometimes we just wound up sleeping in barnyards or in farmyards with chickens and cows, which was fine. I mean, it was a place to sleep and it was secure, but it wasn't easy always.
Going back just a second to like back when you were working in finance, you definitely seem like a guy that always worked harder than everybody else and was kind of always on doing the extra bit of research and that sort of thing. Did you have trouble during your career like turning that off and being able to just relax? Because it seems like these trips you've taken, like obviously they're extenuating or whatever, but it does seem like later in your life you were able to step back and not just be working all the time. Is that fair to say? Or
Well, I never considered it work. I loved what I was doing. I was just ecstatic. I wish the market didn't close on weekends because I was so happy doing what I was doing. And I remember it was on the 4th of July, the night before. I was speaking to one of my classmates, and I said, "Bob," he said, "Oh, come whatever to the party." And I said, "No, I've got some work to do." And he, of course, said, "You're a goddamn fool. You're always working. What's wrong with you? Why don't you come and enjoy life?" Now, that was his attitude. But I didn't think I was working. I was just having fun. I couldn't believe how much fun I was having. So other people thought I worked too much, and I certainly worked more than most people. But as I say, I never thought it was work. I was just having a lot of fun.
so in the 90s, eventually you decided that you had to do it again. What made you decide to go back and go around the world another time?
The turn of the millennium, came up. And I realized that nobody had ever been around the world at the turn of the millennium. If they did, they didn't write about it. They didn't put it on the internet. So I realized, and I certainly had not gotten enough the first time. I loved it so much, the adventure. So here was the turn of the millennium coming. I knew it had never been done, or at least if they did it, they didn't write about it. They didn't tell anybody. So I set out to go around the world at the turn of the millennium, which happened to come up in my lifetime. So I did it and loved it.
And you actually got married on the trip, right? How did you meet Paige?
After my first trip, I wrote a book called Investment Biker, and I was making a speech at a museum. She was working at a university, and the president of the university told her, he had told her to read my book, and she read the book, and he told her, oh, that guy's speaking tonight. So she went to my speech, and here we are. I've been married 25 years now, have a couple of children, went around the world, etc.
So this time you took a car. How do you plan a wedding while you're traveling around the world? What are the logistics there?
Oh my God, you asked a brilliant question. Paige did it, but if you're traveling around, we went through Siberia, China, Africa, I mean China and Siberia, and on that trip, and she had to do all of it by phone, by whatever, and it was complicated. Fortunately, she pulled it off, but it took a lot of effort and a lot of concentration to do it because we wanted to get married on January 1st, 2000, which was a pretty, as you may remember, much of the world was closed down on January 1st, 2000. Because, I mean, there were many people who thought that the world was going to collapse because there were stories that the computers would collapse because they were not programmed for that kind of change to a new century, a new millennium. And so a lot of people wouldn't go to work. A lot of people wouldn't do anything because there were fears, rumors that the computer systems in many places would collapse because of the transition. I mean, fortunately, they didn't. Fortunately, we found places that were open. Fortunately, we found workers, and we did get married and are still married.
So it was another period of dramatic change. One thing you mentioned in your books is that you were eating dinner in Moscow, and you could hear bombs while you're eating as Putin was kind of consolidating power. It's kind of interesting that obviously he's still in power, but it's interesting how the world has changed in the last 25 years since then. And the U.S., since then, what we've had was the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and this bigger bubble that we've seen this last decade, 15 years. Do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of what we've seen since that trip? I'm not necessarily asking for investment advice like I mentioned before, but just you have this interesting insight as having been somebody that's traveled around the world a couple times. What do you see about the world that's changed in the last 25 years?
Well, for one thing, credit cards. On my earlier trips, paying or money was a complicated issue. You had to get money across a border, and then you had to pay. And sometimes you didn't have the local currency. And if you had a credit card, many places didn't know what a credit card was in those days. Fortunately, now you can go anywhere with a credit card, and you can get cash advances with credit cards. My goodness, that makes life so much easier and simpler. But in those days, there was no such thing. Many people had never seen credit cards. Many people would only take their own currency. They didn't know what foreign money was. They didn't know what US dollars were even in some cases. So life for international travel, life is much simpler now. In those days, it was a huge complication, including just getting money across borders.
You mentioned in Investment Biker, you actually had a brief couple comments about Ukraine, which Investment Biker was written in like 1994 or around then, I believe. But you actually mentioned Ukraine as a potential country that could fall apart and split apart. I don't want to focus on current events too much, but is there anything you want to say about what's happened there? Not necessarily just these recent couple years, but over the last 25 years?
Well, I'm sure you know that the U.S. instigated that war in Ukraine because as a way to weaken Russia, as a way to weaken the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, it's not been good for the U.S., not been good for the world, but Washington thought they could weaken Russia by instigating a war in Ukraine, and they did. No war has ever been of any use to anybody, this one included. Ukraine was always, I mean, first of all, Ukraine is a gigantic country. It's a huge country. It's never been well managed in my lifetime, anyway. I mean, that part of the world started in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine was there before Russia, and Ukraine developed. And so Russia developed, but Ukraine was never terribly well run, at least in my lifetime. And it looks like it's still not terribly well run. But and that's one reason America could instigate the war and did instigate the war to try to weaken Russia and strengthen America. We'll see if it works or not. So far, we know the results so far. We'll see. You can ask me in 10 years.
So the U.S. obviously, debt-wise and just our economy, it seems like we're obviously in a much worse situation than we were 25 years ago, and even since the 2008 crisis. Since our movie that's coming out this year is about the bailouts and stimulus from 2008, 2009. Looking back, you were one of the people that predicted the housing crash. That's why we interviewed you for the film. But is there a reason that people should go back and learn about the 2008 financial crisis? Can you kind of give people an explanation of why they might want to take a look and see how that applies to what we've experienced these last few years and today?
You will learn a lot if you know about crises, financial disasters, because they're all the same. You know, people have the same emotions, make the same mistakes. They say, oh, it's different this time. You cannot imagine how many times I've heard the expression, it's different this time. It's never different this time, but people think it is. So you should read about what has happened before, because it will help you understand what's happening now. When I say now, whenever now is, it will help you understand what's happening. We all have the same emotions. We all make the same mistakes. It's happened over and over again. And it will continue happening over and over again.
Yeah, that's something we really tried to show in the first film, because we look at the causes of the housing bubble, but we also go over past bubbles, you know, like the Panic of 1920 and the Great Depression. We talk about the stagflation in the 1970s and go through all that. One of the things we cover in the first film is that you moved to Singapore in 2007. You sold your house in New York and moved to Singapore. And since then, your life is dramatically different because you've had some kids. Can you talk about what made you decide to have kids and just the impact that's had on your life and your worldview?
Well, all my life I had been adamant not to have children. I thought the children were a waste of time, money, effort, everything. Then after my trip around the world, my wife said, well, why don't we have a child? Now, I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, you know, why not? If I'm ever going to have a child, I was 60. Well, 60 is a little young to settle down, but I said, if I'm ever going to do it, why don't I do it now? So we had a child, and I realized that it was great. I had a child, and I loved it. I thought it was a good adventure, exciting. So I had another one. So now we have two, and they're both terrific, and it's a lot of fun. And if there's anybody watching this who hasn't had a child, I suggest they think about it. Think hard about it, because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that's a good chance for me to recommend your book, My Gift to My Children. It kind of passes on some of your life lessons. Right now, if you weren't going for investment research or anything like that, you were just, I can only go to one country today, spur of the moment, where would you go in the world?
Well, I'm going to say China just because it is so big and so vast and so many different things happening. So that makes it simple to pick one country, because you can do anything and everything in China. But I mean, Russia, drive across to Siberia. It's quite an adventure. If you want adventure or to see what's changed in the world. China and Russia are obviously two great places, but I mean, most people go to France or Italy or somewhere because those are well-trod, well-proven tourist countries, and there's a lot to see. And in Rome, you don't have to worry about a hotel or a restaurant. You don't have to worry about some of the quote adventures of crossing Siberia. And there's a lot to see and a lot to do. I prefer the less well-trod paths. I like to go to places where nobody goes and nobody's been because I like to see something new. But there are plenty of places out there. If you want excitement, there's lots of excitement, whether it's Paris or the Sahara Desert.
To wrap up, I mentioned earlier that my company is called Let Us Disagree Films, and the whole idea behind that is that we should be able to have discussions and walk away at the end of it and just shake hands and agree to disagree. But one thing we haven't really talked about is religion, and I just want to mention that with all these world travels, like you were meeting Muslims and Hindus, all sorts of people all over the world. And so, did your trip? Did you get any insights from these other philosophies? Like, did you get into meditation from the Eastern philosophies or breathing exercises or anything like that? And do you have anything you want to say about religion after all this?
Well, there is a lot of religion in the world. I assure you of that. Everywhere, there are people who are devout and religious. They may not think what you think, but they're certainly religious and devout in their own ways. Many people extremely devout everywhere, and it's a major force. If a monk or a whatever religious leader comes in and says X, there are many people who will stop and say, oh my gosh, he said X. And so they will then act accordingly or start thinking accordingly because many people do not question the religious leaders. And it's a very, very powerful force wherever you are and whatever the religion. I assure you, you can cross Siberia, you can cross Brazil. There are many people who are very, very devout, and it's extremely important to them, and they act accordingly. So be careful.
What are your thoughts on immigration? Since obviously you are an immigrant and you've had a unique experience there, but just by being somebody that's actually traveled across so many borders and seen borders change, like how do you feel about immigration and whether it should be open borders or whatever?
Well, the more open, the better, if you ask me. I know that immigration has been good for most countries in the world. Look at the United States. Immigration made us who we are. Your forebears, my forebears, everybody's forebears were immigrants from somewhere to the U.S. and then to other countries, perhaps. Immigration has always been good. It's new energy, new ideas, new ways of thinking, new everything. And if you meet an immigrant, you usually wind up thinking new thoughts. And new thoughts are usually good because if you question things, you come up with new ideas and new ways to do things. So I'm extremely in favor of immigration. I would open the borders. I would eliminate passports if I had my way. None of our forebears had passports. They just showed up and said, here we are. And there was nobody to stop them. Nobody to say, where's your passport? They just showed up and here we are. It has been good, in my view, it has been good for the world. It's easy to attack foreigners. They have different language, different skin, different everything. And so there are many people who attack foreigners and attack immigration. In the end, if you go back and look at the facts, you will find that immigration has usually been good.
Yeah, I've been driving Uber a little bit, and that's been a real fascinating experience for me because I live in Iowa City in the United States, and even just driving a little bit, I've given rides to people from like 30 different countries, and it's kind of one of the beauties of the market is that it doesn't matter if they're from India or Pakistan or wherever or what their religion is. We can go for a ride and have a conversation and freely exchange, and then they can move on to the next thing. So personally, I just believe that if somebody wants to come here or somewhere else and they have a place that they can rent or buy, or if they have a job that they can get, I just don't see how a third person can have the right to interfere. But that'll be a conversation for another day, Jim. I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a lot of fun, and hopefully we've gotten to talk about some things that other interviews don't have. I do encourage people to check out your other podcast appearances on other shows, and maybe we can have you back on sometime, because obviously you do have a lot of great insights on the markets and everything that's going on. And people can check out your website, jimrogers.com, and see your upcoming speeches, and also look at videos from all these trips around the world and see the routes you took, and see all your books. And then they can also check out our documentaries at thebubblefilms.com, thefallof2008.com, which is our new one coming out on the anniversary of the Bear Stearns collapse, March 14th. And my production company's website is letusdisagree.com. So I hope people stick around for some other interviews. We have Ron Paul coming up next. So Jim, again, I appreciate you coming on, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I've made a lot of mistakes, so be sure to understand that. But usually I learn from mistakes. Most of us do. But don't think I haven't made many mistakes. I have. But let's do it again sometime. Thank you. Been fun.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All this has happened before, and it will all happen again.
The reality is we have gone from a stock market bubble. Now we have a housing bubble, and when it breaks, whatever causes it to pop, then a lot of people are going to find out, oh my God, not only are my stocks down, my house is down too, and now what do I do?
Charlie, this was the day we were afraid to wake up to: the bankruptcy of one major Wall Street investment bank, the shotgun wedding of another.
Can't be distracted. What's going on with the war? What's wrong with the economy? Stop worrying about that.
They're not only doing the wrong thing, they're doing exactly the opposite of the right thing.
We got into our mess by spending too much money, running up too much debt, and printing too much money, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Which, by the way, would seem how we got into this state of affairs in the first place.
You have to work for money, kids.
No, you don't. It comes from the machine in the wall. I've seen it. Yeah, you just have to push buttons.
Take a greater risk on these mortgages, yes. To give families mortgages who they would not have given otherwise, yes.
It means we use the mighty muscle of the federal government in combination with state and local governments to encourage owning your own home. That's what that means.
I ask all of you just one more time to look at that chart. And I wish I had a lot of other charts to show you that would reinforce that.
You can't buy a house before you have a job.
You get a job, you save for a down payment, then you buy the house.
A lot of people are going to find out, oh my God, not only is my stocks down, my house is down too, and now what do I do?
Jim Rogers knew these bubbles were going to burst, but I didn't. Neither did filmmaker Jimmy Morrison, who started a house painting business less than a month after home prices peaked. His timing couldn't have been worse. But we don't have to make those mistakes again. There are people out there who called it, and next time, maybe we can too.
We've got a growing economy, jobs, incomes. We've got very low mortgage rates.
Housing is going to be a disaster in the next 5 years. You sell housing stocks and you sell Ben Bernanke.
One myth that's out there is that what we're doing is printing money. We're not printing money.
These days, they don't need a printing press. All they need is a computer keyboard.
So we're not a free market then. There is an invisible, there's a benevolent hand that touches us.
Absolutely.
These people in the government apparently don't learn anything at all.
They broke it, and they're trying to fix it by doing more of what broke it in the first place.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that.
What? Of course it could happen again, and it's happened before.
Raw materials were allocated between essential and non-essential business.
I hope they don't lose confidence in their government. I can see why there's skepticism, but it's the only government we got.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.